The studio lights blazed down on me as I stood behind the gleaming marble counter, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the salt. 8 million viewers were watching Celebrity Chef Challenge live, and in 30 seconds, I would begin the most important cooking demonstration of my life. Not because I was trying to win the competition, I'd already lost that 2 years ago in the most humiliating way possible. No, today was about something far more satisfying than victory. Today was about revenge. My mother sat in the front row of the studio audience, her perfectly manicured fingers clutched around her designer purse. That same smug smile she'd worn the night she destroyed my dreams plastered across her Botoxed face. She thought she was here to watch her daughter make a fool of herself again. She had no idea that I knew exactly what she'd done to me 2 years ago, or that I was about to expose her treachery to the entire world. The host, Marcus Sterling, flashed his television-perfect smile at the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest with us today. 2 years ago, Chef Isabella Rodriguez suffered one of the most spectacular failures in our show's history when her signature dish, a dish that had won her 3 James Beard nominations, somehow went catastrophically wrong during the final challenge. The studio audience murmured sympathetically. I could see my mother's smile widen just a fraction. She was enjoying this. But Isabella has returned, Marcus continued, to show us what that dish was supposed to taste like. Isabella, tell us about your grandmother's mole negro recipe. I took a deep breath, meeting the camera's unblinking eye. Marcus, this recipe has been in my family for 5 generations. My great-great-grandmother created it during the Mexican Revolution, and it's been passed down from mother to daughter ever since. I paused, letting my gaze drift to where my mother sat. At least, that's what I thought. The timer buzzed. 90 minutes to prepare the most complex dish in Mexican cuisine, and 90 minutes to execute the most satisfying revenge of my life. But first, let me tell you how I got here. 2 years ago, I was riding high. At 28, I was the youngest chef ever to receive 3 James Beard nominations. My restaurant, Corazon, had a 6-month waiting list. Food and Wine had just named me one of their best new chefs, and Anthony Bourdain himself had eaten at my restaurant twice, calling my mole negro transcendent on national television. Everything changed the night before my appearance on Celebrity Chef Challenge. I'd been staying at my childhood home in Los Angeles, preparing for the biggest moment of my career. The producers had told me I could cook anything I wanted for the final challenge, the dish that would represent me as a chef. There was only one choice: Abuela Esperanza's mole negro, the recipe that had launched my career and made my reputation. I'd spent weeks practicing, perfecting every element of the notoriously difficult sauce that required 28 ingredients and 12 hours of preparation. But the show's format demanded I complete it in 90 minutes, so I developed a modified version that maintained the integrity of the original while working within television constraints. The night before filming, I'd done a final practice run in my mother's kitchen. Every element was perfect: the chilaquiles negro that I'd imported from Oaxaca, the plantain that added sweetness, the chocolate that gave depth, the precise balance of spices that had taken me years to master. I'd portioned everything into containers, labeled them meticulously, and stored them in the refrigerator. Mija, my mother had said, watching me work with that expression I'd learned to mistrust, the one that looked like pride but always came with conditions. You're going to make us all so proud tomorrow. Carmen Rodriguez had been beautiful once. Looking at old photographs, I could see where I'd inherited my dark eyes and high cheekbones. But years of bitterness had hardened her features into something sharp and calculating. She'd been a cookbook author in the 80s, back when authentic Mexican cuisine was having a moment among affluent white Americans who wanted to feel worldly. Her book, Carmen's Kitchen: Traditional Mexican Recipes for the Modern Family, had sold moderately well for about 6 months before disappearing into obscurity. She never forgave the world for not recognizing her genius, and she never forgave me for achieving the success that had eluded her. Growing up, I'd thought her constant criticism was normal motherly concern. Your seasoning is too heavy, Isabella. That sauce is too complex. Nobody wants to eat that. You're trying too hard to be fancy. Every meal I cooked was met with a critique, Every small success diminished with a reminder that real cooking was simple and unpretentious. When I won my first James Beard nomination, she'd said, "Well, those judges don't know real Mexican food anyway." When Corazon earned its first rave review in the Los Angeles Times, she'd sniffed and said, "That critic probably never ate real mole in his life." I'd been too busy building my career to recognize the pattern of sabotage that had started early. The time in culinary school when my knife roll mysteriously went missing the day of final exams. The restaurant investor who'd suddenly backed out after having lunch with my mother. The food blogger who'd written a scathing review of Corazon after my mother had somehow gotten her phone number and called to set the record straight about my cooking. But I didn't understand the depths of her jealousy until that morning at the Celebrity Chef Challenge studio, when everything went wrong. I'd arrived at 6 a.m. for prep, confident and ready. The ingredients I'd prepared so carefully were in my designated refrigerator station, exactly where I'd placed them after the producers had transported them from my mother's house. I began assembling my mise en place, working with the precision that had made me famous. The first sign something was wrong came when I opened the container of ground chilaquiles. Instead of the deep, rich aroma that should have hit me, there was something off, a musty, almost rancid smell. I frowned, but there was no time to investigate. Live television waits for no one. 40 minutes into the challenge, as I was toasting my spices, the smell got worse. Something was burning, but not in the way it should have been. I tasted the sauce and nearly gagged. It was bitter, astringent, completely wrong. The chilies had somehow been contaminated, but with what? I tried to salvage it, adding more chocolate, more plantain, desperately attempting to balance flavors that had gone fundamentally wrong. But there was no saving it. The judges tasted my mole negro, the dish that had made my career, and their faces said everything. Padma Lakshmi actually spit it out. Gordon Ramsay called it an insult to Mexican cuisine. Marcus Sterling looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't believe this was the same chef who'd received such acclaim. I was eliminated in front of 8 million viewers. But worse than the elimination was the confusion. How had a dish I'd made thousands of times gone so catastrophically wrong? The answer came 6 months later, in the most unexpected way. I was cleaning out my grandmother's house after her funeral when I found the letters. Abuela Esperanza had saved everything: birth certificates, immigration papers, family photographs, and a shoebox full of correspondence dating back decades. Most of it was in Spanish, love letters from my grandfather, updates from relatives in Mexico, the usual detritus of a long life. But there was one letter that made my blood run cold. It was from my mother to my grandmother, dated 15 years ago, written in English in my mother's distinctive handwriting. "Mama, you need to stop giving Isabella those recipes. She's getting too confident, thinks she's better than the rest of us. That mole negro is our family recipe, not hers to profit from. I've been her mother for 23 years. Don't I deserve some credit for her success? Why does she get to be the famous chef when I'm the one who taught her everything she knows?" The letter went on for 3 pages, a rambling manifesto of resentment and entitlement that revealed the depth of my mother's jealousy. But it was the final paragraph that shattered me. "I've been thinking about ways to humble her a little. Maybe if her cooking failed publicly, she'd remember that she's not as special as she thinks she is. She needs to learn that family loyalty is more important than personal glory." I found 12 more letters in the box, each one more vindictive than the last. My mother had been plotting against me for years, systematically undermining my confidence and sabotaging my relationships within the industry. And that last letter, dated just 3 months before my Celebrity Chef Challenge appearance, outlined her plan in chilling detail. She'd known I would be practicing that recipe the night before filming. She'd known exactly which ingredients would be most vulnerable to tampering. And she'd known that spoiled chili powder would ruin everything while being nearly impossible to detect until it was too late. But the letters revealed something else. Something my mother didn't know she'd told me. In her rambling jealousy, she'd admitted to stealing something that didn't belong to her. The mole negro recipe wasn't our family recipe at all. It was Abuela Esperanza's creation, developed during her 20-year career as a chef in Mexico City before she immigrated to Los Angeles. My grandmother had been a culinary genius in her own right, trained in classical French technique, but rooted in traditional Mexican flavors. The recipe that had made my career was her masterpiece, not some ancient family heirloom, and my mother had been claiming credit for it for decades. The discovery should have destroyed me. Learning that your own mother had sabotaged your career out of petty jealousy, that she'd been willing to humiliate you in front of millions of people just to make herself feel better, should have sent me into therapy for years. Instead, it filled me with something much more useful: rage. Cold, calculating, patient rage. I spent the next 18 months planning. Not just planning my comeback, but planning the perfect revenge. Because I'd realized something as I read those letters. My mother's sabotage had given me something more valuable than she'd taken away. It had given me knowledge. Knowledge is power, and I was about to wield it with surgical precision. The first step was rebuilding my reputation. The disastrous Celebrity Chef Challenge appearance had damaged my credibility, but it hadn't destroyed it entirely. I'd closed Corazon. The rent was too expensive to maintain during the months-long reservation drought that followed my public humiliation, but I'd used the time to write a cookbook. Corazon, Recipes from My Grandmother's Kitchen, was my love letter to Abuela Esperanza and my declaration of war against my mother. Every recipe was meticulously researched, every story carefully fact-checked. I interviewed my grandmother's friends from Mexico City, tracked down her former colleagues, even found the restaurant where she'd worked as a young chef. The book was a critical and commercial success. Food critics praised my authentic voice and deeply personal storytelling. The mole negro recipe, recreated exactly as my grandmother had originally developed it, became the signature dish at pop-up dinners that sold out in minutes. But success wasn't enough. I wanted justice. The opportunity came when Marcus Sterling called personally to invite me back to Celebrity Chef Challenge for a special redemption episode. The format would be simple. 5 chefs who'd suffered spectacular failures on the show would return to cook the dishes that had defeated them, with no competition, no elimination, just a chance to show America what had gone wrong. I accepted immediately, and then I called my mother. Mija, she'd gushed when she heard my voice. I saw the announcement on Instagram. You're going back to that show. Are you sure that's wise? After what happened last time? I want you there, I'd said, my voice carefully neutral. In the audience. I need your support. I could practically hear her preening through the phone. Of course, baby. Your mother will be there cheering you on. Just maybe this time you should cook something simpler. That mole negro is so complicated, and you know how you get nervous under pressure. Even now, 18 months later, she couldn't resist twisting the knife. Actually, I'd said, I'm going to cook the mole negro again, but this time I'm going to tell everyone where the recipe really came from. There had been a pause, a long, telling pause. What do you mean? She'd asked. And for the first time in my life, I'd heard uncertainty in her voice. I found Abuela's letters, Mom. All of them. The line had gone dead. She'd called back an hour later, her voice syrupy with false sweetness and barely concealed panic. Isabella, baby, you know how your grandmother was toward the end. All those stories about Mexico City, about being a chef, that was just fantasy. She was getting old, confused. The mole negro has been in our family for generations. Mom, I'd said quietly, I have photographs. I have her employment records. I have interviews with people who worked with her at Restaurante Esperanza in 1962. I know exactly who she was and what she accomplished. Another pause. What do you want? She'd asked, and finally, I'd heard fear. I want you in that audience, I'd said. I want you to watch. Now, standing in the Celebrity Chef Challenge kitchen with cameras rolling and my mother squirming in her front row seat, I began the most important cooking demonstration of my life. The foundation of any great mole negro, I said, addressing the camera while I heated my comal, is understanding the chilies. Most people think all dried chilies are the same, but each variety brings its own character to the sauce. I held up a pristine Chilhuacli negro, its skin glossy and unmarked. This is what a good Chilhuacal should look like: smooth, flexible, with a deep, complex aroma when you tear it open. I demonstrated, releasing the rich, earthy scent that filled the studio. 2 years ago, when I was on this show, someone had contaminated my chilies with rancid chili powder. I continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. It's actually quite clever. Chili powder spoilage isn't immediately obvious to the untrained nose, but it creates a bitter, astringent flavor that ruins everything it touches. In the audience, my mother had gone very still. Of course, I continued, beginning to toast the chilies. You'd have to know quite a bit about Mexican cooking to sabotage someone that precisely. You'd have to understand that mole negro is the most complex sauce in our cuisine, that it requires perfect balance, and that contaminating the foundation would destroy everything else. Marcus Sterling was watching me with obvious confusion, clearly not understanding where this narrative was heading. But the camera operators had caught on. I could see them adjusting their angles to capture both me and the audience. The interesting thing about sabotage, I said, moving on to toast my sesame seeds, is that it reveals as much about the saboteur as it does about their target. For instance, the person who contaminated my ingredients 2 years ago had to have detailed knowledge of this recipe. They had to know which ingredients would be most vulnerable and exactly how to ruin them without being detected. I began grinding the toasted ingredients in my molkajet, the rhythmic scraping filling the silence. Which means they either had access to my practice sessions or... I paused, looking directly at the camera. They'd been watching me cook this dish my entire life. The studio had gone deadly quiet. Even Marcus seemed to realize that something significant was happening, though he clearly didn't understand what. You see, I continued, my voice gaining strength. This isn't actually my family's recipe. It was created by my grandmother, Esperanza Rodriguez, during her 20-year career as a chef in Mexico City. Abuela was trained in classical French technique but specialized in traditional Mexican cuisine. She worked at some of the finest restaurants in the city before immigrating to Los Angeles in 1965. I pulled out a manila folder that I'd placed strategically near my prep station. I have her employment records here. Photographs of her in chef's whites. Interviews with colleagues who remember her mole negro as legendary. The cameras were definitely focused on the audience now. I could see my mother in the monitor, her face pale, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. After my grandmother immigrated, she stopped cooking professionally. She got married, had children, and like so many immigrant women, she put her own ambitions aside to support her family. But she never stopped being a chef. I began adding ingredients to my sauce base, working with the precision that had made me famous. She taught this recipe to her daughter, my mother, in the 1970s. And for decades, my mother claimed it as her own creation. The murmur that went through the studio audience was audible even over the sizzling of my pan. Carmen Rodriguez wrote a cookbook in 1987 called Carmen's Kitchen: Traditional Mexican Recipes for the Modern Family. In it, she presented my grandmother's mole negro as a recipe that had been in her family for generations, never mentioning that her mother had actually created it during her professional career. I looked up from my cooking, meeting the camera's eye. My mother spent my entire childhood telling me that I was too ambitious, too fancy, that I didn't understand real Mexican cooking. She criticized every dish I made, undermined my confidence at every opportunity, and told anyone who would listen that my success was undeserved. The sauce was beginning to come together now, the complex layers of flavor building exactly as they should have 2 years ago. But the truth is, I learned to cook from my grandmother. Every technique that made me famous, every instinct that earned me James Beard nominations, every bit of knowledge that built my career, I got it from Abuela Esperanza. My mother knew this, and she couldn't stand it. I pulled out another document from my folder. These are letters my mother wrote to my grandmother over the years. In them, she complains about my success, claims credit for my achievements, and plots ways to humble me. Marcus Sterling had abandoned all pretense of hosting and was simply watching, transfixed. In one letter, dated 3 months before my original appearance on this show, my mother outlines her plan to sabotage my cooking. She knew I'd be practicing this recipe the night before filming. She knew exactly which ingredients to contaminate and how to do it without being detected until it was too late. The studio erupted in gasps and whispers. I could see my mother trying to shrink into her seat, but there was nowhere to hide with 8 million people watching. She destroyed my reputation, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. because she couldn't bear to see me succeed with a recipe she'd been stealing credit for my entire life. I tasted my sauce and smiled. Perfect, exactly as it should be. But here's what my mother didn't understand about sabotage, I said, turning back to the camera. When you try to destroy someone out of jealousy, you often give them exactly what they need to destroy you back. I began plating my dish mole negro over slow braised chicken, garnished with sesame seeds and a sprinkle of crumbled queso fresco. Because now, thanks to my mother's letters, I have documented proof of her theft. I have evidence of her sabotage, and I have a platform to tell 8 million people exactly who Esperanza Rodriguez really was. I held up a black and white photograph, my grandmother in chef's whites, standing in the kitchen of Restaurante Esperanza, her face serious and professional. Abuela Esperanza was a pioneer. She was cooking sophisticated, authentic Mexican cuisine in Mexico City when most Americans thought Mexican food was just tacos and burritos. She was developing complex sauces and innovative techniques decades before Mexican cuisine became fashionable in American restaurants. The timer buzzed. 90 minutes were up. She deserved recognition for her genius, I said, setting down my completed dish. She deserved to have her legacy honored, not stolen. And she deserved better than a daughter who was so consumed with jealousy that she'd sabotage her own granddaughter rather than admit the truth. Marcus Sterling approached my station cautiously, as if approaching a bomb that might explode. Isabella, he said carefully, these are some very serious accusations. They're not accusations, I replied calmly. They're facts. I have documentation for everything I've said here today. Employment records, photographs, interviews, and my mother's own written confession. I gestured toward the audience. My mother is sitting right there in the front row. She's been watching this entire demonstration. If anything I've said is untrue, now would be the time for her to speak up. All eyes turned to Carmen Rodriguez. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing every nuance of her panic and humiliation. "Mom," I called out sweetly, "would you like to tell everyone how this recipe really came to be in our family?" The silence stretched out for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, my mother stood up on shaking legs. She started, then stopped. She looked around at the faces staring at her, crew members, audience, cameras, and seemed to realize that there was no escape, no lie sophisticated enough to explain away what I'd just revealed. "I need to go," she whispered, and bolted for the exit. The studio erupted in chaos. Audience members were buzzing with shock and disbelief. Crew members were frantically checking with producers about whether to keep filming. Marcus Sterling was trying to regain control of his show, while simultaneously grappling with the reality that he'd just broadcast one of the most dramatic family confrontations in television history. But I stood calmly at my station, ladling mole negro onto plates for the judges to taste. "The sauce is ready," I announced. Padma Lakshmi approached first, her expression carefully neutral. She took a small spoonful, chewed thoughtfully, and closed her eyes. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "Rich, complex, perfectly balanced. This is what mole negro should taste like." Gordon Ramsay was next. He'd been unusually quiet during my demonstration, but now he stepped forward with obvious interest. He took a larger bite, savoring it carefully. "Bloody hell," he said finally. "This is restaurant quality. This is better than restaurant quality. This is—" He paused, searching for words. "This is perfection." The third judge, a guest chef from Oaxaca named Elena Morales, approached with tears in her eyes. She'd been part of the panel specifically because of her expertise in traditional Mexican cuisine. She took a bite and immediately began nodding. "See, Sai, this is how it should be," she said in accented English. "This is the mole negro of my childhood, of my grandmother's kitchen. This is the real thing." She looked at me with something approaching reverence. "Your grandmother, she was trained professionally?" 20 years in Mexico City," I confirmed. "Restaurante Esperanza, Casa de la Cultura, El Convite. She worked with some of the greatest chefs of her generation." Elena nodded slowly. "I know these names. These were serious kitchens. Your grandmother, she was a real chef." "Yes," I said simply. "She was—" Marcus Sterling had finally managed to restore some semblance of order to his show. The audience had settled down, my mother was gone, and the judges had completed their tasting. He approached me with the expression of a man who'd just witnessed something unprecedented. "Isabella," he said, "in 30 years of television, I've never seen anything like what just happened here. You came back to cook a dish, and instead you solved a mystery, exposed a fraud, and honored your grandmother's legacy, all while creating what might be the most perfect mole Negro ever served on this show." He paused, looking at the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's safe to say that Isabella Rodriguez has achieved her redemption." But redemption wasn't enough, not anymore. The real satisfaction came later, after the cameras stopped rolling and the studio audience filed out and the crew began breaking down the set. I was packing up my knives when Marcus approached me one final time. "Off the record," he said quietly, "what you did today, was it worth it? The public humiliation, the family destruction, the burned bridges?" I considered the question carefully. My mother spent 30 years stealing credit for my grandmother's work. She spent my entire life undermining my confidence and sabotaging my success. She was willing to destroy my reputation on national television just to make herself feel better about her own failures. I closed my knife case with a decisive snap. She taught me that family loyalty should go one way, always toward her, never toward me. So I decided to teach her a different lesson about loyalty, which is that it has to be earned. The fallout from the Mole Negro incident, as the food media immediately dubbed it, was swift and overwhelming. The episode aired as scheduled 3 weeks later, but clips started appearing on social media within hours of filming. By the next morning, #Mole Negrogate was trending on Twitter, and food bloggers were frantically researching everything they could find about Esperanza Rodriguez. The first major piece ran in Food and Wine 2 days later, The Forgotten Pioneer, Esperanza Rodriguez and the Hidden History of Mexican Cuisine in America. It featured the photographs I'd shared on the show, interviews with her former colleagues that I'd conducted for my cookbook, and a detailed analysis of her contributions to Mexican-American culinary culture. Bon Appetit followed with an investigation into cookbook plagiarism in ethnic cuisine, using my mother's book as a case study in how immigrant women's contributions are often erased or appropriated by their own families. The article sparked a broader conversation about cultural ownership and family dynamics that dominated food media for months. But the most satisfying piece was published in the Los Angeles Times food section a week after the episode aired. The headline read, "Carmen Rodriguez, from cookbook author to cautionary tale." It detailed my mother's attempts to claim credit for recipes she hadn't created, her pattern of undermining other chefs, including her own daughter, and her final humiliation on national television. The article included a quote from my mother that made me laugh out loud. "I was just trying to preserve family traditions. Isabella is blowing this out of proportion because she's always been dramatic." Even in disgrace, she couldn't accept responsibility. My mother tried to mount a comeback, granting interviews to smaller publications where she painted herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter's vendetta. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and her own letters too damning. The few restaurants that had featured her recipes quietly removed them from their menus. Her literary agent dropped her. The cooking school where she'd been teaching authentic Mexican cuisine to suburban housewives terminated her contract. Meanwhile, my career exploded. The cookbook I'd written about my grandmother became a bestseller within weeks of the episode airing. Publishers were calling with offers for follow-up books. Restaurant investors were reaching out about financing a new location. Food Network offered me my own show. But more importantly, I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do. I'd restored my grandmother's legacy and exposed my mother's theft for what it was. 6 months after the episode aired, I opened Esperanza, a fine dining Mexican restaurant in Los Angeles that focused exclusively on dishes from my grandmother's era. The menu featured her original recipes, prepared exactly as she'd developed them in Mexico City, alongside historical context about each dish and the woman who'd created it. The restaurant was booked solid for the first year within hours of announcing the opening. Food critics hailed it as a revelation, praising both the sophistication of the cuisine and the way I'd honored my grandmother's memory. Michelin gave us 2 stars in our first year, unprecedented for a Mexican restaurant in Los Angeles. The most gratifying review came from Jonathan Gold, the legendary Los Angeles Times critic, who wrote, At Esperanza, Isabella Rodriguez has created more than a restaurant. She's created a monument to a forgotten genius. Esperanza Rodriguez's mole negro isn't just a sauce. It's a masterpiece of flavor and technique that deserves to be remembered alongside the great sauces of French cuisine. That it took 3 generations and a public family feud to restore proper credit to its creator is both tragic and oddly fitting in a city built on reinvention and redemption. But the real victory came a year later, when the James Beard Foundation announced that they were creating a new award, the Esperanza Rodriguez Award for Culinary Heritage Preservation, recognizing chefs who work to document and honor the contributions of overlooked culinary pioneers. I was the first recipient. Standing on the stage at the James Beard Awards, looking out at an audience of the most celebrated chefs in America, I thought about my grandmother. About the young woman in chef's whites who'd left Mexico City with dreams of sharing her cuisine with the world, only to spend 40 years watching others take credit for her work. "This award isn't for me," I said into the microphone. "It's for Esperanza Rodriguez, and for all the women like her whose contributions have been forgotten or stolen. It's for the immigrant cooks who brought their traditions to America, only to see them appropriated and commercialized by others. It's for the grandmothers whose recipes launched 1,000 careers but never got a byline." I paused, thinking of my mother watching at home, if she was watching at all. And it's a reminder that the truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to bury it, even when your own family tries to erase you. The applause was thunderous. Later that night, at the after-party, Marcus Sterling found me at the bar. He'd become something of a friend in the year since the episode aired. The incident had been the highest-rated celebrity chef challenge in the show's history, and it had earned him a James Beard Award for Outstanding Television Personality. "So," he said, settling onto the stool next to me, "any regrets about how you handled things?" I sipped my mezcal and considered the question. Just one. Which is, I wish my grandmother had lived to see it. Think she would have approved. The public confrontation, the family drama, the way you destroyed your mother's reputation. I smiled, remembering the fierce woman who'd taught me to cook, who'd insisted on perfection in every dish, who'd never let anyone diminish her standards or her dignity. Abuela Esperanza spent her whole life being too polite to claim credit for her own work, I said. She let my mother steal her legacy because she thought that's what good mothers were supposed to do. Sacrifice themselves for their children, even ungrateful ones. I finished my drink and stood up. I think she would have been proud that someone finally had the balls to set the record straight. As I walked away, I could hear Marcus laughing behind me. The epilogue to this story plays out in small moments now, years later. When young chefs approach me at industry events to tell me that Esperanza's story inspired them to research their own family histories. When food historians credit my grandmother's work in academic papers about Mexican cuisine. When the cookbook I wrote about her wins awards and inspires other people to document their own family legacies before they're lost. And when food bloggers occasionally ask what happened to my mother, I always give the same answer. I don't know and I don't care. Because that's the truth. After 30 years of trying to earn Carmen Rodriguez's approval, after decades of enduring her criticism and sabotage, after a lifetime of being told I wasn't good enough, I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. Some people don't deserve your loyalty, even if they're family, especially if they're family. My grandmother deserved better than a daughter who stole her legacy. She deserved better than a granddaughter who was too afraid to speak up. And she definitely deserved better than spending eternity watching someone else get credit for her life's work. Now, finally, she has what she deserved: recognition, respect, and a legacy that will outlive all of us. As for my mother, she got what she deserved too. And in my kitchen at Esperanza, hanging above the pass where every plate of moldy negro is finished, there's a black and white photograph of a serious young woman in chef's whites, standing in the kitchen of Restaurante Esperanza in Mexico City, 1962. The caption reads, Esperanza Rodriguez, chef and pioneer, 1932 to 2018. Every dish that leaves my kitchen carries her name. Every review that praises my cooking honors her memory. Every young chef who learns her techniques extends her legacy. That's the revenge I'm proudest of, Not the destruction of my mother's reputation, but the resurrection of my grandmother's. Some legacies are worth fighting for, some truths are worth telling, no matter the cost. And some families are worth leaving behind to find the ones that really matter. In the end, the mole Negro was perfect, just like she taught me it should be.